The crystal chandelier cast rainbows across the marble entrance hall of the Al-Rashid mansion, as 18-year-old Layla Al-Rashid stood in her designer outfit, pointing an accusatory finger at Grace Mitchell, who knelt quietly, mopping the pristine floors in her simple blue cleaning uniform. "You're dirtier than the floor you're cleaning." Layla sneered with the entitled cruelty of someone who had never questioned whether the world owed her deference, and with a swift kick of her expensive heel, she sent Grace's bucket of soapy water cascading across the marble, creating a spreading puddle that would require hours of additional work to clean properly. What the spoiled heiress didn't know was that Grace Mitchell held a doctorate in international relations from Oxford University, and had once served as a diplomatic advisor to heads of state, though circumstances beyond her control had forced her to accept employment that utilized none of her extraordinary qualifications while she rebuilt her life after a career-destroying scandal. The confrontation that was about to unfold would shatter every assumption Layla had about worth, intelligence, and the dangerous consequences of judging people by their current circumstances rather than their true capabilities and character. The kicked bucket sent dirty water spreading across the marble floor in all directions, creating a mess that would take hours to clean properly, and destroying the morning's work that Grace had completed with meticulous care. But the physical damage was less significant than the symbolic violence of the act, which demonstrated Layla's complete disregard for both Grace's dignity and the value of her labor. Grace watched the water spread across the floor with the same composed expression she had maintained during international crises that affected millions of people, her diplomatic training having taught her that emotional reactions often escalated conflicts rather than resolving them, though the deliberate destruction of her work represented exactly the kind of petty cruelty that she had hoped to escape when leaving the world of high-stakes politics. The spreading puddle reflected the chandelier light in fractured patterns that created an ironic beauty from the destruction, while Grace began calculating how to address the additional cleaning that would be required, without allowing Layla's behavior to provoke the kind of response that could jeopardize her employment and the income she needed to support her elderly mother's medical expenses. "Now look what you've made me do," Layla said with theatrical exasperation, as if the deliberate act of kicking the bucket had been Grace's fault rather than her own choice to escalate a verbal attack into physical destruction. "This is exactly what I mean about your incompetence creating more problems than it solves." The attempt to blame Grace for destruction that Layla had deliberately caused revealed the twisted logic that allowed privileged people to avoid responsibility for their actions by portraying themselves as victims of other people's inadequacy, creating narratives that justified continued abuse while absolving the abuser of accountability. Layla's morning had already been ruined by her father's refusal to increase her monthly allowance from $50,000 to $75,000, a decision that she viewed as unreasonable given her upcoming shopping trip to Paris and the charity gala, where she needed to outshine her social rivals with an outfit that would establish her superiority over other wealthy teenagers whose parents controlled smaller fortunes than the Al-Rashid oil and real estate empire. The rejection of her financial demands had created frustration that sought outlet through attacking someone who couldn't defend herself without risking economic consequences, because Layla's emotional immaturity prevented her from processing disappointment in healthy ways that didn't involve harming innocent people who happened to be available as targets for her displaced anger. The pristine marble floors that Grace had been methodically cleaning represented hours of careful work to maintain the mansion's spotless appearance for the frequent social gatherings where Layla's family entertained other wealthy elites. But the teenager's self-absorption prevented her from appreciating either the skill required for such work or the dignity that Grace maintained despite the demeaning circumstances of her current employment. "I suppose you expect me to clean this up too," Layla continued, gesturing at the spreading water as if the suggestion was absurd rather than a natural consequence of her deliberate actions. "This is exactly why servants need to understand their place and avoid creating situations that inconvenience their employers." The characterization of her own destructive behavior as Grace's responsibility demonstrated the kind of psychological manipulation that wealthy people often use to maintain their sense of superiority while engaging in obviously inappropriate conduct, creating alternative narratives that preserved their self-image as reasonable people dealing with inadequate subordinates. Grace knelt beside the spreading puddle and began absorbing the water with towels from her cleaning cart. her movements efficient and professional, despite the additional work that Layla's tantrum had created, because her years of diplomatic experience had taught her that responding to provocation with dignity often revealed more about character than any verbal defense could accomplish. The sight of Grace cleaning up the mess without complaint or accusation seemed to increase Layla's agitation rather than satisfying her desire for dominance, because the older woman's composed response suggested inner strength that threatened the teenager's need to feel superior to the people around her. "Don't just ignore me when I'm talking to you," Layla demanded, her voice rising with the petulant fury of someone who had never been denied attention when she demanded it. "I am your employer's daughter, and you owe me the respect that comes with my position in this household." The demand for respect based on inherited status rather than earned character revealed the fundamental flaw in Layla's understanding of human relationships, because her privileged upbringing had taught her that deference should be automatic rather than reciprocal, and that economic power justified treating other people as objects rather than individuals with their own dignity and worth. Grace continued her cleaning work without responding to Layla's demands for attention, her silence representing not disrespect, but rather the professional focus that had made her effective in diplomatic roles, where maintaining composure under pressure was essential for achieving productive outcomes in challenging situations. The refusal to engage with Layla's emotional manipulation demonstrated exactly the kind of boundary setting that the teenager had rarely encountered from adults, most of whom either indulged her tantrums or avoided confrontation, rather than modeling appropriate responses to inappropriate behavior. "You're dirtier than the floor you're cleaning," Layla repeated, her original insult taking on additional cruelty in the context of the mess she had deliberately created. "At least the floor serves a useful purpose, while you're just taking up space and wasting everyone's time with your incompetence." The escalation from personal insults to existential dismissal revealed the depths of cruelty that could emerge from privileged entitlement when combined with emotional immaturity and lack of empathy for people whose circumstances made them vulnerable to abuse from those with economic power over their livelihoods. Grace's educational background included advanced degrees in art history and cultural studies, in addition to her doctorate in international relations, making her far more qualified to discuss human worth and social hierarchies than someone whose understanding of such concepts was limited to whatever privileges her father's money could purchase. But revealing such credentials would create complications that could threaten her employment and the income she needed for her mother's care. The irony of being called worthless by someone whose greatest accomplishment was being born into wealth was not lost on Grace, whose career achievements had included negotiating peace agreements, developing humanitarian aid programs, and advising world leaders on complex international issues that affected millions of lives across multiple continents. "Perhaps I should focus on other areas of the house," Grace suggested quietly, her diplomatic training providing strategies for de-escalating confrontational situations by removing herself from proximity to the aggressor, rather than continuing to provide targets for displaced anger and frustration. The offer to simply move elsewhere rather than defend herself caught Layla off guard, because service workers in her experience typically responded to her attacks with either defensive anger that justified continued abuse or submissive apologies that confirmed her sense of superiority over people she considered inherently inferior. "That's exactly the problem with people like you," Layla snapped, her frustration growing as Grace's composed responses failed to provide the emotional satisfaction that she had been seeking through her attacks. "You have no pride or backbone. You just slink away whenever someone points out your obvious inadequacies." The accusation about lacking backbone was particularly ironic, given that Grace's current circumstances resulted from her refusal to compromise her integrity when confronted with corruption in her previous career, and that her willingness to accept honest work rather than engage in questionable activities demonstrated exactly the kind of moral courage that Layla's privileged upbringing had failed to develop. Grace's transition from diplomatic advisor to domestic worker had resulted from a whistleblowing incident where she had exposed corruption in an international aid organization, leading to legal retaliation and professional blacklisting that had destroyed her career despite the accuracy of her allegations and the positive changes that eventually resulted from her courage in speaking truth to power. The personal cost of maintaining integrity in the face of institutional corruption had included not just career destruction, but also legal expenses that had consumed her savings and forced her to accept whatever employment was available. While she rebuilt her professional reputation through volunteer work with human rights organizations that valued her expertise, but lacked resources to provide adequate compensation. The decision to prioritize integrity over career advancement had been conscious and deliberate, based on values that emphasized moral responsibility over personal benefit. But explaining such choices to someone like Layla would require discussions of ethical complexity that the teenager's privileged worldview had never encouraged her to consider or understand. "I take pride in doing any job well," Grace responded gently, her voice carrying the dignity that came from understanding that honest work possessed value regardless of how others chose to perceive it, and that character was measured by how people treated others, rather than by their economic circumstances or inherited social status. The quiet assertion of dignity without defensiveness or anger demonstrated the kind of inner strength that had made Grace effective in international negotiations, where maintaining composure under pressure was essential for achieving productive outcomes, but which Layla interpreted as stubbornness, rather than the self-possession that came from genuine self-knowledge and moral clarity. "Pride in scrubbing floors and mopping up messes?" Layla laughed, her mockery revealing the shallow values that characterized her worldview and her inability to recognize that dignity could be found in any honest labor performed with skill and dedication. "That's exactly what I mean about having no ambition or intelligence." The suggestion that intelligence could be measured by current job titles revealed Layla's fundamental ignorance about how complex factors, including economic inequality, systemic discrimination, institutional corruption, and personal circumstances beyond individual control, could affect even the most capable people's career trajectories and employment opportunities. Grace's colleagues from her diplomatic career would have been shocked to see her current circumstances, not because domestic work was inherently shameful, but because they understood that her expertise in international relations and conflict resolution made her qualified for positions that could influence global policy and improve millions of lives through strategic intervention and careful negotiation. The irony of Layla's comments about intelligence was that Grace's Oxford doctorate required intellectual capabilities far beyond anything that had been demanded of the teenager, whose academic performance at expensive private schools had been supplemented by tutors and grade inflation that ensured wealthy students achieved credentials regardless of their actual learning or demonstration of genuine understanding. "Intelligence comes in many forms," Grace replied diplomatically, her response demonstrating the kind of measured wisdom that had made her valuable in complex negotiations, where understanding multiple perspectives was crucial for finding solutions that addressed everyone's interests while maintaining respect for different cultural values and social systems. The philosophical observation about different types of intelligence was lost on Layla, whose educational experience had focused on competition and status, rather than genuine learning or appreciation for the diverse ways that human capabilities could be expressed and valued in different social and economic contexts. "Don't lecture me about intelligence," Layla retorted, her anger intensifying as she sensed that Grace's responses contained depths of understanding that threatened her assumptions about intellectual superiority based on wealth and social position. "I'm the one with the education and opportunities, while you're the one who obviously failed at whatever you tried to do before ending up here." The assumption that Grace had failed at her previous career was technically accurate, but missed the crucial context that her failure had resulted from choosing integrity over personal advancement, and that her current circumstances reflected systematic problems with how society treated whistleblowers rather than any deficiency in her capabilities, character, or professional competence. The conversation attracted the attention of Layla's mother, Fatima al-Rashid, who entered the foyer with the composed elegance that had made her a respected figure in international social circles, despite her husband's tendency toward ostentation rather than genuine sophistication. Her diplomatic background, having taught her to recognize when situations required adult intervention to prevent escalation into more serious conflicts. "Layla, what's happening here?" Fatima asked, her tone carrying the authority of someone who expected honest answers rather than manipulative excuses. because her own upbringing in a diplomatic family had taught her to recognize emotional manipulation and address underlying issues rather than accepting surface explanations that avoided accountability. The arrival of her mother created both opportunity and risk for Layla, who could either acknowledge her inappropriate behavior and accept guidance toward better choices, or double down on her attacks against Grace, while hoping that family loyalty would override objective assessment of the situation and her obvious responsibility for the conflict. "This woman doesn't understand appropriate behavior for domestic staff," Layla replied. Her version of events designed to portray herself as maintaining proper household standards rather than engaging in unprovoked cruelty towards someone who couldn't defend herself without risking her livelihood and economic security. Fatima's expression shifted as she observed the scene, noting the water spreading across the marble floor, Grace's dignified posture, despite being on her knees cleaning up the mess, and Layla's aggressive stance that suggested she had been the aggressor in whatever confrontation had been taking place during her absence. "Grace has always been professional and respectful," Fatima said quietly, her assessment based on months of observation rather than accepting Layla's emotional interpretation of events. "I'm curious what specific behavior you found inappropriate that would justify this apparent conflict." The question forced Layla to articulate her complaints in terms that would sound reasonable to her mother, but her accusations about Grace's attitude and competence seemed petty and unconvincing when stated explicitly rather than delivered as general insults, designed to humiliate rather than address genuine workplace issues. "She acts like she's too good for her job," Layla complained, her criticism revealing more about her own insecurities than about Grace's actual behavior or professional performance. "She doesn't show proper respect for our family's position and the opportunities we've given her." The characterization of dignity as disrespect demonstrated exactly the kind of confused thinking that resulted from privileged upbringing without proper guidance about human relationships, social responsibility, and the difference between respect based on character versus deference demanded through economic power and inherited status. "Respect is earned through character, not demanded through wealth," Fatima replied firmly, her response drawing on cultural values that emphasized personal virtue over material success and rejecting the notion that economic circumstances justified treating other people as inherently inferior or unworthy of basic human dignity. The lesson about authentic respect versus demanded submission was one that Layla's privileged upbringing had failed to provide because her parents had focused on giving her material advantages without teaching her the character traits necessary to use those advantages responsibly and ethically in relationships with people from different economic backgrounds. "I'd like to understand Grace's perspective on this situation," Fatima continued, her diplomatic experience having taught her that conflicts often involved multiple viewpoints that needed to be considered before making judgments about appropriate responses or consequences for inappropriate behavior. The invitation for Grace to speak created an opportunity for her to defend herself, though her diplomatic training suggested that focusing on resolution rather than blame would be more productive for everyone involved and more likely to result in positive changes rather than increased hostility and resentment. "I was simply completing my cleaning duties when the bucket was accidentally overturned," Grace said calmly, her response avoiding any direct criticism of Layla, while making it clear that the mess had not resulted from her own carelessness or incompetence, as suggested by the teenager's accusations. The diplomatic phrasing that characterized the deliberate destruction as an accident demonstrated Grace's professional skill at de-escalating conflicts while providing accurate information, though Fatima's experience with such careful language suggested that there was more to the story than what was being explicitly stated. "Layla, did you overturn Grace's bucket?" Fatima asked directly, her question cutting through diplomatic evasions to address the specific action that had created the mess and escalated whatever verbal conflict had been taking place before her arrival. The direct question created a moment of crisis for Layla, whose privileged worldview had never required her to acknowledge destructive behavior or accept responsibility for actions that harmed other people, but whose mother's authority could not be ignored without facing consequences that would affect her lifestyle and social freedom. "It was an accident," Layla lied, her attempt to avoid accountability demonstrating that she had not yet learned the lessons that her confrontation with Grace was meant to teach about honesty, responsibility, and the consequences of treating other people as objects rather than individuals deserving of respect and consideration. "I saw you kick the bucket deliberately," Fatima replied, her observation having been made from the doorway before she announced her presence, providing her with objective information about her daughter's behavior that could not be dismissed or rationalized away through alternative explanations. The revelation that her mother had witnessed the deliberate destruction forced Layla to confront the reality that her lies had been exposed, and that she would need to take genuine responsibility for her actions rather than continuing to avoid accountability through deception and manipulation. "Layla, I think you owe Grace both an apology and compensation for the additional work your behavior has created," Fatima said firmly, her directive based on clear evidence that her daughter had been engaging in inappropriate conduct that required acknowledgement and repair rather than justification or excuse. The demand for both apology and compensation represented a more serious consequence than Layla had anticipated, because it required her to acknowledge wrongdoing and provide material recognition of the harm she had caused, rather than simply offering empty words that cost her nothing while preserving her sense of superiority. "I'm sorry the bucket got knocked over," Layla offered, her non-apology designed to minimize her fault while appearing to comply with her mother's directive, though the passive language avoided accepting responsibility for her deliberate actions. "That's not an adequate apology," Fatima said firmly, her diplomatic experience having taught her to recognize when people were avoiding accountability rather than genuinely acknowledging their mistakes and committing to better behavior in the future. The rejection of Layla's hollow apology forced her to confront the reality that her behavior had been unacceptable and that she would need to take genuine responsibility for her actions rather than simply going through the motions of social politeness, while maintaining her internal sense of superiority and justification. "I apologize for deliberately kicking your bucket and creating additional work for you," Layla said finally, her words carrying more sincerity, though they still reflected incomplete understanding of why her behavior had been wrong, beyond violating household politeness and creating practical inconvenience. "Apology accepted," Grace replied graciously, her diplomatic training providing frameworks for forgiveness that focused on learning and growth rather than punishment or continued resentment, though she understood that genuine change would require more than single moments of accountability. The gracious acceptance of an imperfect apology demonstrated the kind of character that had made Grace effective in international relations, where building bridges often required overlooking past offenses to focus on future possibilities for cooperation and understanding between people with different backgrounds and perspectives. "Grace, would you join us for coffee?" Fatima asked, her invitation representing a gesture of respect and an opportunity to learn more about someone whose presence in their home might represent hidden depths that deserved recognition and appreciation, rather than casual dismissal based on place, current employment circumstances. The invitation to share refreshments as an equal, rather than continuing to work as an employee, symbolized a shift in relationships that acknowledged Grace's humanity and value beyond her current job responsibilities, creating opportunities for conversation that would reveal the vast gap between assumptions and reality. Before we wrap this story up, I'd like to congratulate you for reaching this far, and if you enjoyed this story as much as I think you did, then be sure to check out the rest of our channel for more exciting and inspirational stories like this one. And don't forget to show your support by liking and subscribing so this channel can reach more people just like you. Now back to the story. Over coffee, Grace's conversation revealed not only her impressive academic credentials, but also her practical experience in diplomatic negotiations, international development projects, and cross-cultural communication that had taken her to dozens of countries and exposed her to challenges that had tested her intelligence, courage, and integrity in ways that privilege could never replicate. The stories she shared about her work in conflict resolution and humanitarian aid provided both Fatima and Layla with perspectives on global issues that their privileged lives had never allowed them to encounter directly, opening their eyes to realities beyond their wealthy bubble and the ways that accomplished people sometimes faced circumstances that forced them into employment that didn't reflect their true capabilities. Years later, when Layla had completed her own studies in international relations and was working for humanitarian organizations that addressed global poverty and inequality, she would credit Grace with teaching her the most important lesson of her privileged life: that true worth was measured by character and contribution, rather than wealth and status, and that the most valuable education often came from people whose circumstances might suggest they had nothing to teach.